Hello and welcome back to the course. We're starting with Chapter 1, Mastering Security Basics. So these concepts are going to be the building blocks for everything you do in your career as a security professional, cybersecurity professional. If you keep these things in mind and tie every security concept back to these goals, it will serve you very, very well. So this is a brief introduction. We're going to talk about security goals, risk concepts, the various types of controls that CompTIA wants you to know about. We're even going to talk about virtualization, things like hypervisors and virtual machines. And we're going to talk about some of the command line tools that you will be able to utilize. I can't stress enough how important it is to make friends with the command line early in both Windows, Mac, or Linux. Many of these tools will allow you to get information much more quickly than having to run some desktop program or some GUI, and they will allow you to do things like scripting as well. So let's talk about the CompTIA use case. So what is a use case? A use case is where everyone in the company tries to achieve a goal. An example of this would be if you called a company and their customer service takes your order, their finance department processes your payment, and of course production makes the product itself, and then the dispatch team would mail it to you. So another way of looking at the use cases is that they're an example of how something is going to be used. And in the following examples, we'll see different use cases for different protocols. So let's talk about the core security goals. We have the first pillar of the CIA triad, confidentiality. So to put this in military terms, confidentiality is ensuring that unauthorized personnel don't read messages or have access to data that they shouldn't. And confidentiality is achieved by various methods like encryption, access controls, and even steganography and obfuscation. So you might hear about encryption is the process of taking some kind of plain text or some information and running it through an algorithm and converting it to ciphertext. All this means is that we're trying to scramble the data to make it difficult for somebody to read or listen in on. So when we get into things like access controls, we will talk about services like Radius and TACACS. We'll talk about access versus authorization versus accounting. So access controls could be physical, they could be technical, and say software. They could even be simply permissions, many different ways. And then the last term we want to understand is obfuscation, which is basically taking some data, or could be a payload, could be a script, could be really anything, and then you're hiding its true means. You're trying to turn it into something that is unintelligible, or it doesn't reveal what it actually is doing, maybe to bypass a firewall or some other type of network security appliance. Now let's talk about integrity. Integrity involves ensuring that the data has not been changed in transit. Here what we're really talking about is the ones and zeros, because if even a single bit of the data is changed, that would be considered a violation of integrity. So how do we ensure integrity? Well, we can use something called a hashing function. A hashing function is the process of performing an integrity check on some type of data. There are many different hashing algorithms like MD5, SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3. Hashing should be done in such a way that we ensure that the data was not modified in transit, so we can take our important system files and run them through a hash function, which in theory would be hard to undo. It's easy to run some data or plain text through a hashing function, and this is a very common way in which we store passwords. Passwords are typically stored as their hashes rather than their plain text. Then we have digital signatures. Digital signatures are similar to physical signatures, but we're using a special certificate. We can provide something that is known as non-repudiation. Now, non-repudiation means that, for example, if I were to send you an email, if it was signed with my digital certificate, you would have assurances that I sent you the email. This would also provide the benefit that I cannot turn around and deny that I sent that email. This is otherwise known as non-repudiation. So what are digital certificates, you might ask? Well, digital certificates are like electronic passwords, and they allow you to send and retrieve information securely over the internet. More commonly, websites using digital certificates secure banking transactions. They secure your online shopping purchases at Amazon, eBay. Certificates can be either purchased from a company like DigiCert for a fee, or they can be obtained for free from a service like Let's Encrypt. The only downside with Let's Encrypt is that you have to renew them every 90 days, whereas the purchased ones will typically be good for anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Now let's talk about another one of the core security goals, availability. So this is the next pillar in our CIA triad. This means that the information is accessible when an authorized user needs to view it. Availability can be assured by many different components. So one of the first components we use to ensure availability, as you can see here from the servers on the diagram to the left, redundancy. So one computer is obviously good, but we can add more benefit by adding in more servers or more systems. So this means we can add hard drives, extra RAM, we can add multiple servers. So if in the event here, we connect the 3 servers to a load balancer, so they can provide something called fault tolerance. So fault tolerance means that if one server goes down, the other 2 will pick up the traffic and the user will not notice any difference. This is a very common method of approach in the cloud. And lastly, we want to make sure that our systems remain available by running them through some kind of patching protocol. This could be a patch management program in the case of Windows, such as WSUS, but this is overall part of a comprehensive security strategy and ensures that systems are maintained in an up-to-date, secure state. Some highest secure networks will only provide access to systems that are fully patched, up to date, and thus preventing unnecessary vulnerabilities from being introduced. So now let's talk about some basic risk concepts. So threats, you can see the diagram on the left-hand side here. Threats can come in many forms. They can be nation states, hackers, disgruntled employees, or more commonly known as insider threats. We will talk about the various types of threats later. So then we have vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses in software, firmware, or anything that can be used to create an exploit and compromise the system. And then we have risk. Well, risk is the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability and create some kind of a loss, something like data exfiltration, data tampering, etc. Risk mitigation is the process by which we reduce the likelihood that a threat actor might exploit a vulnerability. There are many different types of controls with which we can do this, as you'll see in the upcoming slides. So then we have some different control types, and these are what CompTIA wants you to understand for the exam. So control types come in 3 different families. There are 3 main families of control types. We have technical controls, we have administrative controls, and then we have physical controls. And we'll get into what each one of these specifically are, and then also ultimately under each one of these 3 main families, there are different goals that we want to achieve with them. So technical controls use the word technology. So things like firewalls, ACLs, and then administrative controls, they will be things like policies, security policies more specifically. And lastly, we have the physical controls, which is anything you can physically touch, like barriers, fences, and whatnot. So what are technical controls? Well, things like encryption. Technical controls can provide many of our three different goals of security. Our confidentiality, for example, in the case of encryption. We can have antivirus to make sure that we only have trusted versions of our system files. And we might use software like intrusion detection systems to make sure that we can be notified whenever an attack is going on. So technical controls also usually will follow something called the principle of least privilege. So what does this mean? The principle of least privilege goes something like this. You are given the least amount of access needed to be able to do your job. So if you always keep that privilege in mind when designing a system, you will make sure that unnecessary risks are not introduced and unnecessary vulnerabilities. So now let's talk about administrative controls. You probably deal with these every day, even if you don't realize it. Administrative controls are kind of the backbone of any security policy or overall strategy. So administrative controls might be risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, and even penetration tests. So these activities may be technical in nature, but overall, the process itself will fall into the administrative control type. And we'll see some of the examples here listed as well, like your user awareness and training, which might be an annual requirement depending on, like in the federal government. What about configuration and change management? Well, that's making sure that anytime you make changes to a system, to the network, to the security, that you have some kind of way of documenting it. Of course, media protection, that's making sure that we properly label our media, we use the correct type of media for our networks. And then of course physical and environmental controls. All of these come, even though they may be physical controls, they can be part of the strategy for administrative controls. Then we have physical security controls. Well, these are any kind of controls you can physically touch. So your lighting, your signs saying keep out, fences, and even security guards. And so let's talk about the different kinds of goals. So we talked about the three families, the technical, the physical, and the administrative. Well, you could have administrative controls that are also preventative and maybe a deterrent. So let's talk about the goals first. We have to understand the definitions of the different goals before we can understand how they work together with the different control families. So the first goal is preventative. This makes us try to prevent an incident from occurring. So we put a preventative control on something to keep something from happening. Then we have detective control goals. So this means we're trying to detect when something occurred. Like in the case of the word detection is actually in the name of the control, like an intrusion detection system. Then we have corrective controls. Corrective controls try to fix something that's already happened. That means there's already been an incident and we're trying to mitigate or reduce the overall impact or risk to our organization. And then we have deterrent controls. We are trying to deter or discourage individuals from causing an incident. I can think of a great example in the federal government where we put warning banners on top of the system before you're allowed to log in. You press Control-Alt-Delete and you see a warning banner. Well, that's a deterrent control. It could be a sign. It could be any number of things to prevent people from performing some action. And then we have compensating controls. So just like the word compensate, if we can't do one of the types of controls and it's not feasible, maybe it's a cost prohibitive thing or there's just not expertise to do the control, we can put in a compensating control to mitigate risk. Now let's look at some of the different preventative controls versus detective. So preventative, like we said, this is trying to prevent something from occurring. This could be done through detecting, hardening, change management. Hardening is basically the way in which you lock down a system, right? So you take a Windows 10 machine or a Linux machine and you run it through some different security checks to improve its security posture. So that would be an example of a preventative control. So what about guards? Well, guards, we're trying to prevent things from being stolen out of the store. You can think about loss prevention in retail stores. And of course, we have disabling default accounts like administrator accounts, or maybe we have a disgruntled employee and we want to prevent them from performing some action, so we disable that particular user account. So whereas detective controls, so we have things like they detect intrusions, or they detect system issues like logs, syslog, event monitoring in Windows, trend analysis. So trend analysis we haven't talked about yet, but it's basically looking at those logs and those monitors and trying to determine what trends, like how many, is there a lot of data being extracted? Is there a lot more traffic than normal? We can also look at security audits and video surveillance and even motion detectors. So now let's talk about detection versus prevention. So detection can't really predict when an incident recurs, right? It doesn't really understand, it doesn't have the ability to foresee the future. So we can't prevent incidents, and we'll continue to use the detective controls even after an incident has occurred. Preventative controls try to stop the incident before it occurs. This is a key distinction between an intrusion detection system and intrusion prevention system, or an IDS and an IPS. Yes, there are some IDSs and IPSs like Snort that are combo devices that can do both, but in the basis terms possible, this is the key distinction. And then we have corrective controls versus compensating controls. So corrective controls, that something's already happened. Some incident has already occurred, and we're trying to reverse the impact of it. So this could be an active IDS, which means an IDS that is called an active IDS is really more like an IPS, but it means that it can take some action, and it can turn things off or disable certain ports or accounts. A corrective control might be a backup. Say we get hit with ransomware, and now we have to reverse that impact. They've encrypted all the files, so now we have to restore from a backup. So corrective controls are for fixing an incident. Compensating controls are for when certain things are not feasible. An example of this might be using an uninterruptible power supply, an UPS, versus a generator. Maybe we don't have the budget for a large-scale generator for a building, so we use UPSs instead. And then we have deterrent controls. So deterrent, just like it sounds, we're trying to deter people from doing something they shouldn't, like stealing laptops. So a perfect example of this are the cable locks on your laptop. You know, if you lock it to the desk with a cable lock, then it's harder for someone to steal it. It's not impossible. What about server cabinet locks or your switch closet? Those should be locked, right? So those are deterrent controls. So deterrence tries to get people to not take an undesirable action. Prevention stops them from taking an act. So we see that a case of a physical control like a security guard can be both a preventative and a deterrent. Now let's talk about virtualization, and there's some key terms we have to understand before we can understand virtualization. The first part of virtualization is, I want you to understand, we're using some type of resource to host multiple systems. So there are different ways of doing it. So virtualization is really transforming the way computing is done in many different aspects, and it also has a big role to play in the cloud. So the first term we want to get here is hypervisor. Well, what is a hypervisor? A hypervisor is some type of software that controls the system. And we'll talk about more detail about the different types of hypervisors here in a minute. But first, the hypervisor is kind of the controlling factor for virtual machines. So hosts, or host OS, is the machine that's hosting the VM. So that could be a Windows machine, a Linux machine, a Mac machine. And then we have the guest operating system. That is the operating system that is running on that host. And then we have a couple of concepts. Host elasticity. Well, elasticity is the ability to add and remove resources on an as-needed basis. So this is particularly important in areas like the cloud, and it's one of the major draws for services like AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. Well, elasticity means we only pay for what we need. So if we come across a situation where we need extra resources, we can expand and add more resources, and then we can take them off later or deprovision them. Then we have host scalability. So this is the ability of adding more resources to a system, like adding more CPU, more RAM, more hard drives. So in the example here, we have one host operating system and we have 5 guest operating systems. And each of the systems, the virtual systems, they appear as a unique host on the network. And we'll see how they do that a little bit later. Now let's talk about the different types of hypervisors. You can see pictured here at the top we have type 1 and we have type 2. So type 1 is what is known as a bare metal hypervisor. So what does that mean? Well, it runs directly on the hardware and there's no host operating system required. So an example of this might be VMware's ESXi. Type 1 hypervisors are more expensive and they also are usually much faster because they don't have to worry about a host operating system to negotiate between them and the guest operating systems. And then we have the type 2 hypervisor. So this is something that runs software within an operating system. An example of this would be VirtualBox, VMware Player, Microsoft Virtual PC, Hyper-V. And we'll get more into the detail about how this works. The great thing about virtualization is that we can run, say, a Linux operating system on top of our Windows host. So as you can see here, we have VirtualBox. This would be considered a type 2 hypervisor. I have multiple operating systems on it, but of course I can't run them all at the same time. And we've talked about the concept of a snapshot and a backup. You can see here I have a Kali Linux virtual machine with some snapshots that are taken. I can right click on here and I can change the settings. I can clone this virtual machine. I can move it other places. But you'll notice a certain menu screen, and this is very common to all of the different types of hypervisors, but you'll have some way of managing the storage, the system. So we can see here, I give it a name, I tell it where I want it to be stored. There's some other links here, and any other. If I want to do encryption, I could do an encrypted virtual machine. Look at the system, we can talk about how much RAM we should have. So I currently have 2 gigabytes of RAM allocated, but I could add more. I tell it what order I want the system to boot in. And do I want to enable USB support so I can attach devices to it. Then we have our display, which if I need extra video memory, I could do that. And then probably our more important part here is our storage. So we can see where the virtual size of the hard drive noted here is actually 80 gigabytes, but the actual size on disk is much less. So it gets dynamically allocated. And we have our audio drivers, and this is our more important part, our network adapters. So we could actually connect to our regular network address, and just like our wireless network or our home Wi-Fi. We could have multiple network adapters, so a virtual machine could be part of multiple networks. And then we can hook up serial ports to it. And if we want to be able to drag and drop from we could change the interface, some other things here. If we want to be able to send information to and from a virtual machine, we can do that. So I'll go ahead and boot up Kali Linux here and just get that running. So that is type 1 versus type 2 hypervisors. Now let's talk about application cell virtualization, or we might call this containerization or container virtualization. What this means is that we're running apps and services in their own containers, just like Docker or Kubernetes. The key points to remember about virtualization and containers is that containers require much less resources than virtual machines. And there's some different options if you want to go to with containers versus virtual machines. So here we see on the diagram that each container talks through the host operating system to the hardware, and the kernel will do the negotiation between the container. But the container has everything it needs to be able to run whatever service it's serving up. So then virtualization. So we talked about having redundancy and fault tolerance. So one of the ways we do that with virtualization, we can use snapshots. Snapshots are much like backups in traditional computing. So the nice thing about a VM is that restoring from a backup to a PC, we can also restore from a snapshot to a certain point in time. Some of the Type 2 hypervisors may not have snapshot capability. Like if you get the free version of VMware Player, you can only run one virtual machine, and it does not allow you to do snapshots. So now a couple more terms we need to understand. You see VDI or VDE. So VDI is Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, and VDE stands for Virtual Desktop Environment. VDI is a strategy for data centers to be able to supply hosted desktop images or desktop environments to remote users. So VDE is the singular desktop environment. VDI is the way in which it is served up. And you can have a couple of different virtual desktop environments. You can have persistent, which keeps the user changes, or you can have non-persistent, which doesn't keep the changes. Now let's talk about some of the risks associated with virtualization. Well, in the case of virtual machines, they are stored as files. They can actually be moved to another location. So let's take a quick look at how that could be done. So if we go to our virtual box here and we right click on it and we click Show in Explorer, it'll actually show us the folder location. And we can see here that these are virtual machine files. So you'll notice the Kali Linux box, the .vdi, is about 21.5 gigabytes. We can see there's some other settings here that go with it in this text file. And then there's some VirtualBox machine settings. We can look at logs from the individual virtual machine. We can look at snapshots. So each snapshot also takes up space on a disk as well. So it's definitely something to be concerned if you're worried about storage space. The more virtual machines you add, the more snapshots you take, the more storage space you're ultimately going to use. Now let's talk about VM escape. Well, what is VM escape? This is where an attacker uses a virtual machine to get out of the virtual machine itself and access the guest operating system. So this can be problematic, and there are many vulnerabilities which have let this occur. So this is why you must have a proactive security strategy for your VMs, and they must be tracked just like a physical hardware. This is the problem you run into of VMware sprawl. VMware sprawl, or VM sprawl, I should say. This means that people are just creating virtual machines without any controls, and there's no inventory. Now let's talk about Kali Linux. Kali Linux is a penetration testing version of Linux. So Linux, to understand Linux, we have to understand the old Unix operating system. Linux was created by Linus Torvalds, and there are many different distributions or versions of Linux. Kali just happens to be the one that can be installed on Windows as well as the Microsoft App Store. First, we'll take a look at the Kali website. So this is what you see if you go to kali.org. That is the website where you can download the distribution. You go to the top window here and click on Downloads, and we can get multiple versions of Kali. We can go to the 64-bit install live distributions as well, which means that you can install them without having to change the underlying hardware. There are even virtual machine versions of Kali Linux. So you have to click on this link here with the Offensive Security download page, and it will pop up your virtual image. So once you download this, then you'll be able to actually open it with one of the Type 2 hypervisors that we talked about. And you'll notice here they actually have the SHA-256 SUM, so we can do some integrity checking and make sure we download a clean copy of the ISO. One other key thing to remember here with Kali, if we go back to kali.org, there are lots of documentation for Kali and every single tool that they have. So you can go to the tools listing page and see all the various tools they have for everything from forensics to sniffing to password attacks to spoofing. Lots of different options here. And there are many free labs for Kali as well as on the Get Certified, Get Ahead Premium.com website. Keep in mind, though, you may need to register to access the actual Kali Linux labs. Now let's talk about some of the command line tools and how we work with them. In Windows, we can launch a command prompt. We can go to the Start menu, and we can right-click. We'll go ahead and click on the window up our command prompt here. So you'll notice a few things in our command prompt here. So we have C:\users, and that's the user account that I'm currently logged in with. We can type things like ipconfig /?, and it will give us a listing of information about how we use the particular tool. We can also run the Windows command prompt using several shortcuts that you might want to be aware of. We can press the Windows command key along with X and then C. That will run a command prompt in normal mode. If we do Windows and X plus A, we will get a administrative command prompt. We can also type Alt or F4 to exit the command prompt, or we can just type exit at the screen. So some of the tools that you might run may require you to run commands as an admin, and other ones you might be able to get away with just running as a normal user. Now, Linux, let's talk about Linux commands. So Linux has something called a terminal. You notice the picture on the right-hand side. There is a shortcut that allows you to launch it on most Linux distributions. You can click on the shortcut, and most Linux distributions will have the same type of setup. So some of the first few things we want to make you aware of on a Linux command terminal. Here you can see we have the login screen for Kali Linux. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and log in. The default username for most of these is root, and the password is just root backwards, or Tor. We'll go ahead and close these little warnings from the VirtualBox. You can right-click on the screen to do different things. Usually if it captures the cursor, what you'll want to do is you'll want to hit the right control button to get out. So we'll go ahead and go over to the left-hand side, and we'll click on the terminal, and up will pop a terminal box. So what we can do here, we'll notice if we start doing shortcut keys, it captures the cursor. So if we want to go back to our regular desktop, we'll have to hit the control button. So one of the most important things with Linux is tab completion. If you can't remember a certain command, you could just type in the name of the command, like. So we can type ping, and we can just type the first couple letters, and we hit tab, and it will give us some suggestions of some different things. So if we want to ping, it'll actually give us some other options. So that's tab completion. So if you forget a command, this is one of the key points to remember. And it also allows you to complete previously typed command as well. And Linux does remember command history. So once we type some commands, if we just hit the up arrow, it will actually remind us of all the commands we've typed in. We can even print the history out to the screen using the history command. Let me go ahead and clear the screen. So if I want to clear the screen, I can type CLEAR, or clear. And so that's how we launch a terminal in Kali. Let's go ahead and get onto some basic terminal commands. So Linux is typically case sensitive. Windows rarely is case sensitive. So that means that I can type a command in Linux, and if I have the caps lock on, it will not recognize the command. Whereas in Windows, if you run the command, it usually will still run it properly for you. So it's important to be aware of what you're typing and make sure that you're using the proper case. So there's some other things with Linux. Linux normally uses a dash on extra switches for different commands. You can do the Control-C command if you need to break out of a terminal process or you want to stop a program that's running. You can also do Control-Z, which will actually send a running program to the background. So if you want it to stay running but you want to get your terminal back, you can do that. So if you want to clear, you could also type Control-L, and that will also clear the screen for you in Linux as well. Now let's talk about some basic commands. Ping. Ping stands for Packet Information Grover, which is, interestingly enough, the name of the command. So it uses something called ICMP, or Internet Control Message Protocol. So ICMP, it can be used to enumerate firewalls. It can be used to find out where DNS servers are. Ping is a very useful tool, and it's up to many organizations to decide whether they want to block it or if they want to allow it. So we'll go ahead and open up our terminal again, and we'll go ahead and ping www.google.com. And we can see that it's sending out 4 requests on Windows. On Linux, it actually just pings until you tell it to stop. But you'll notice here that it puts ICMP sequence numbers on each packet. So what that is letting us know that that's the first packet is the sequence number of 1. And it comes back with a response. It also tells you the time to live, or TTL value. That's how many hops the packet can take before it drops. So I'm going to hit Control-C because I don't want it to keep on pinging indefinitely. Alright, so that is our discussion on ping, or ICMP. So now we'll look at some of the different commands in Windows and in Linux. So in Windows, it's going to be ipconfig, and Linux is going to be ifconfig, which are very, very close. So we'll go ahead and go back to our command prompt here. Let me go ahead and clear the screen, and we'll do an ipconfig/all, and that will give all of our interfaces, our current IP address, our DNS information, any other, even virtual networks will show up here, like our VirtualBox host adapters. We can do an ipconfig and flush out our DNS if we're having problems getting to a website. There's other commands we can do with ipconfig, like release, if you want to obtain a new IP address if we're on a domain environment. Now let's move over to our Windows environment. I should say our Linux environment, excuse me. So we'll open up Kali Linux again. We go ahead and clear the screen, and we'll do an ifconfig. If we give it no parameters, it will just return us back some basic information about interfaces. In this case, we're on a virtual machine, so we have an Ethernet and we have a loopback address, that's L0. Notice it gives you the IP version 4 address, as well as the network mask and the IP version 6 address, which you see it here shorthanded, ::1. We'll come back to that later, but it'll tell you how many packets transmitted, how many packets received, and if there are any errors and things like that. So we also can get our MAC address from this as well. We can see what our broadcast address is, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So if we do a man ifconfig, so this is configuring a network interface. So there's a whole lot more information. So this is what are known as the kernel resident network interfaces. So if you give no arguments, it gets the currently active interface. So there might be interfaces that are not active and aren't displayed that you might want to be able to configure. And so if you give a -v, you might give more information called verbose. You can change the MTU size. You can do lots of different things here with this command. So let's look at also IP, the IP command. So again, this is before. IP will show your routing information.
All right, so let's look at what IP can do for us with respect to routing. We can do IP route, and we can see our default route. We can see that we have currently one route, the 10.0.2.0/24. We have a metric of 100. We can do other things with IP route. We hit tab, we can monitor traffic, can look at different protocol metrics. So we could say TCP metrics. You could see layer 2 tunneling protocol. We could show if we had a session here. So there's other things we could let me clear the screen. IP. You can see all the different addresses. So we could add IP addresses, we could delete IP addresses, we could change them, we could flush out different IP addresses. So a lot you can do with the IP command. We can also look at IP neighbor. We can add a neighbor, or we can show. You can see that currently the neighbor that's attached here is actually stale. So Traceroute is a useful command for Windows and Linux. So let's go ahead and switch over to our Linux machine. So I'll go ahead and clear the screen here from before. Notice I typed it incorrectly. If I type in Traceroute in all caps, it doesn't know about it. Or if I type in Traceroute, it doesn't know about it either. So what we'll have to do is we'll type in Traceroute, the full word, and then we can do tab completion. We could do lots of different things. So let's say I want to traceroute to Google as before, and it's going to take up to 30 hops to try and resolve where that hosts are at. So in this case, we're having some issues, potentially. So if we do the man as before, we can look at the man page for Traceroute. And we can pick different interfaces. We can pick the type of traffic. It basically just takes the path that an IP packet takes from its source to its destination. And it does something with the time to live field, or TTL field. And if the time to live is less than the number of hops you have, then you'll get what's known as a ICMP time exceeded response. So there are layer 4 trace routes. You could trace route on a particular port. There's trace route for the purposes of debugging, lots of different things. But trace route, ultimately, the basic point of it is to find out a particular network path and how long it takes. All right, so let's look at ARP, Address Resolution Protocol. Well, what does ARP do for us? ARP does some very important things for us. ARP is one of the ways in which switches communicate traffic. So if you're trying to send a message from one computer to the other, and you're going through a switch, you might utilize ARP to get there, to help you out. So ARP will help learn the IP address and the MAC address that is connected to each port. So it sends out what's known as an ARP broadcast, and it will send that out to the device to determine what computer is on what port. So in Linux, we'll go ahead and switch over to our Linux machine. And we can type ARP, and if we don't give it any information, it will, in this case, it only knows about one connection because it's a virtual machine. You could do ARP-A, which gives you the same information, or we could look at the man page And we could get more verbose information. We could look for different types. We could even do file names. So these are some examples of using ARP traffic, and you can use ARP for different interfaces. And these are the particular files that it's located in. So if we go look at ARP on a Windows environment, it actually shows up the ARP table. And we'll go ahead and go back over to our command prompt. And we'll do a ARP. And we didn't give it any protocol, so it tries to recommend us or we didn't give it any switches. So we'll do an ARP-A, which will display our entire ARP table. Notice we have a couple of different addresses here, depending on the network. So the .7 network is the network I'm currently connected to for my ISP. This 56.1 is a virtual network. So you'll notice this type column over here. It has static or dynamic. So dynamic means that it had to learn via ARP the actual addressing. If it's static, that means it was automatically pre-created by some software or maybe the adapter itself. So we can do a ARP dash. There's no. We do ARP-A-B. That'll give us a little bit more information, but in this case, there's not a ton of data in the ARP table. So that is Netstat, ARP, and Traceroute. So for Chapter 1, we've covered a lot of different material. So we talked about core integrity goals, core security goals, like the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We talked about the basic concepts of risk management and risk mitigation. We talked about different types of controls: technical, administrative, physical, and their various goals. We also covered virtualization, including key concepts like hypervisors and containerization. And then we looked at some of the basic command line parameters for both Windows and Linux hosts as well. Notice that we remember that Mac runs a Linux type command terminal. So most of the commands, if you type them in on Mac, you will do them the same as you would a Linux machine. And for more information, check out the labs located at the link on the screen. In the next chapter, we will cover identity and access management.